historic and Roman Britain from around 3000 BC was inhabited by people known as Iberians, who used polished flint implements and practiced agriculture. Another race known as Beaker folk introduced bronze working around 2000 BC. Several waves of Celtic invaders using iron weapons followed after around 700 BC. They developed trade with Europe, and their tribal organization was developing into a system of kingdoms when Julius Caesar made his visits in 55 and 54 BC. The Roman conquest began in AD 43 and by AD 80 had reached the Scottish lowlands. After a brief period of resistance, Roman culture was accepted. The upper classes becoming completely Romanized. At an early date, Christianity was introduced. Then during Anglo-Saxon England, an obscure 200 years followed the withdrawal of the Romans in 407, during which the Germanic Angles and Saxons overran all England except Cornwall, Wales and Cumberland. How far the Celtic population survived is uncertain. In the 6th century, Christianity was again introduced, this time by missionaries from Ireland and Rome. England was divided into several kingdoms, the chief being Northumbria, Mercia, Kent, and Wessex, who battled for supremacy until in 829 they all accepted Egbert of Wessex as overlord. His successors were confronted with the Danish raids, and although Alfred expelled the Danes from Wessex in 878, he had to cede them the north and east of England. During the 10th century, this was reconquered and a real national unity achieved. But Danish raids began again in 991, and during 1016 to 42, England was ruled by Danish kings. Norman influence predominant under Edward the Confessor prepared the way for the Norman conquest of 1066. In early Middle Ages, as England advanced toward unity, the Anglo-Saxons had developed from a tribal society to a system somewhat akin to the feudalism introduced by the Norman kings. The contrast between the law and order they had established and the disorder of Stephen's reign made a return to a strong monarchy generally acceptable. Nevertheless, when John attempted to claim more than was his due by feudal standards, barons, church and towns united against him to assert their privileges in Magna Carta. This alliance was renewed against Henry III in a struggle. Then emerged the House of Commons, an family of knights and burgesses side by side with the older baronial assembly or House of Lords. The combination of king, lords and commons began with Edward I's model parliament of 1295. Edward completed the conquest of Wales begun by the Normans and attempted unsuccessfully to conquer Scotland. In Ireland, there had been a Norman colony since 1169. In the later Middle Ages, commercial interests were mainly responsible for the 100 Years' War with France. The financial problems they created enabled Parliament to secure control of taxation and to control the king's choice of ministers by the weapon of impeachment. The later 14th century was filled with unrest. The Black Death created a serious labor shortage, and attempts to deal with it led to bitter class struggles, culminating in the Peasants' Revolt 1381. In spite of the rising failure, serfdom steadily declined during the 15th century. Popular anti-clericalism found expression in the Lollard movement, which anticipated the Reformation. When Richard II moved towards absolutism, Parliament replaced him by Henry IV, who was obliged to grant it unprecedented powers. Henry V's attempt to conciliate the nobility by renewing the French War ended in his son's reign in disaster and led directly to the Wars of the Roses. Order was restored by Edward IV, and after a change of dynasty by Henry VII, who broke the political power of the feudal nobility. During Tudor England, Henry VIII followed this up by bringing the church under royal control, repudiating the papal power, dissolving the monasteries and confiscating their wealth. In this policy, he received the enthusiastic support of Parliament and the landowners, who benefited by the confiscated lands. Under Edward VI, the English Church adopted Protestant doctrines, but after a Catholic reaction under Mary, Elizabeth I adopted a compromise whereby the church's doctrines became Protestant and its ritual semi-Catholic. These changes coincided with and encouraged a movement whereby many of the three peasantry who had arisen after the disappearance of serfdom were evicted to make room for sheep farms. Modern capitalism began with the development of the woolen industry and of trade with Russia, Turkey, and later with India. Trade rivalries combined with political reasons to involve England under Elizabeth in a war with Spain, where she emerged as a major naval power. The English Revolution under James I ended the cooperation between king and parliament, which had continued with some strength through the Tudor period. The gentry and merchants, enriched by church lands, enclosures, foreign trade and industry, took advantage of the crown's financial needs produced by the inflation which followed the import of American silver to seize control of the state machine. The issues were complicated by the struggle between the state church and the Puritans, who became identified with the parliamentary opposition. During the Revolution of 1640 to 60, England passed through civil war to republicanism and to military dictatorship. The Restoration of 1660 restored to the monarchy the show rather than the substance of power. Charles II worked with considerable success to reverse the work of the revolution, but James II's attempt to carry this process further provoked a new revolution in 1688, which placed political power in the hands of the Whig landowners and merchants. Ireland, which had been finally conquered by the Tudors, rose for her independence in 1641 and 1689, only to be reduced to the status of a colony. Meanwhile, the foundation of the empire was laid in North America and India, a process which involved England in three wars with the Dutch. The accession of James I had brought England and Scotland under one king, and among the results of the Revolution of 1688 was the union of their parliament in 1707. In the 18th century England, another result of 1688 was the Second Hundred Years' War with France, the successor of Holland as England's commercial and colonial rival. In this series of 7 wars, British sea power proved decisive and the French were ousted from North America and India. At home, the supremacy of Parliament found expression in the establishment of cabinet government under Walpole. The power of the Whig land-owning and merchant oligarchy, supreme since 1714, was challenged by George III, and for 70 years the Tories were almost continuously in office. Those years were troubled by the successful revolt of the American colonies and the French Revolution, which stimulated the growth of the democratic movement in England. In Ireland, a powerful movement arose for complete independence, which Pitt countered by carrying through a parliamentary union with Britain. At home, agriculture was revolutionized by a new wave of enclosures, whereby the small farmer was driven off the land or reduced to be a landless laborer. At the same time, mechanical progress and the rise of the factory system converted England from an agricultural to an industrial country without a serious rival. Two new classes emerged from the change, the industrialists and the industrial workers, bitterly hostile yet united in a demand for parliamentary reform. In the 19th century, the alliance of the industrialists with the Whigs produced a new party, the Liberals, who in 1832 carried a reform bill transferring political power from the aristocracy to the middle classes. For the next 40 years, liberalism, with its ideology of free trade and laissez-faire, was triumphant. The working classes, excluded from the franchise, created their own organizations in the trade unions, and the Chartist movement, although the latter disappeared during the years of mid-Victorian peace and prosperity after 1875, Britain's industrial monopoly found rivals in Germany and the USA, and she was obliged to seek new markets and sources of raw materials. The conservatives made themselves the mouthpiece of the new imperialism and launched Britain on a career of expansion in Egypt, South Africa, and elsewhere. The outstanding feature of the history of the empire in the 19th century was the development of Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and later of South Africa into self-governing dominions. The economic crisis of the later 19th century, which encouraged imperial development, also induced the working classes, largely enfranchised in 1867 and 1885, to revive the militant trade unionism and political movement of Chartist days. From an alliance of trade unions and small socialist bodies emerged the Labour Party in 1900. In the 20th century, Britain's commercial and colonial rivalry with Germany led to her abandonment of her traditional isolationist policy, and to her entry into the system of alliances dividing Europe and into a feverish armaments race. At home, a liberal government attempted to satisfy with social reforms a working class demanding a higher standard of living. In 1914, a general strike and a civil war in Ireland seemed imminent, and the Great War created a host of new problems. During the post-war years, Ireland won her independence, unrest swept India, and a wave of mass strikes culminated in the general strike of 1926. After a few years of comparative prosperity, an unprecedented economic crisis devastated most of the world during 1929 to 31. Among its results was the coming to power of the British national government in 1931. The years that followed were dominated by the approach of the World War of 1939-45. Like the Great War, this was followed by a general movement towards the left throughout Europe, one feature of which was the return in 1945 for the first time of a Labour government with an overall majority. At once there was initiated a policy of nationalization, but the serious economic situation was only temporarily improved by a loan from the USA, and the Labour government fought a losing battle with rising world cost, etc. A narrow Labour victory in the elections of 1950 became an equally narrow defeat in those of 1951, and the Conservative government which then took office was confirmed in power in 1955. At present, Sir Keir Rodney Starmer is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom since 2024 and as leader of the Labour Party since 2020. He is a British politician and barrister. Now talking about the English language, its origin belongs to the western division of the Germanic languages. Towards the end of the 7th century, main dialects can be distinguished: the Jutish of Kent, the Saxon of the South Anglican or Mercian of the Midlands, and the Anglian or Northumbrian north of the Humber, which are known collectively as Anglo-Saxon or Old English. This tongue retained much of the complex Germanic grammar and was of the inflectional type. With the decline of a native literature and the effects of the Norman conquest, the standard which had thus been established gave way rapidly, and the transition to Middle English was effected by the leveling of inflections under a few forms, and the gradual degeneration of declensions and grammatical gender, etc., was now a much simpler language, but had no common standard form. And during the 3 centuries of the Middle English period, it was written in a variety of dialects. By the mid-15th century, many of these dialects had ceased to produce literature, and that written in the counties immediately to the north of London was being accepted as a standard, a choice confirmed by the establishment of printing presses in London. By 1650, printers had generally adopted a fixed orthography. Almost purely Germanic at the time of the 5th century invasions, English made some Latin borrowings in the 6th to 10th centuries. Many words used by the Scandinavian settlers passed into the general vocabulary, and from the time of the Norman conquest, it absorbed a large number of French words, particularly those concerning the church, state, law, and feudal system. From the middle of the 13th century, the Romance element in English is as important as the Germanic. These French borrowings closely resemble their Latin originals and prepared the way for continued and extensive Latinization of vocabulary. Greek words were also adopted, particularly with the growth of the various sciences from the 17th century. During the 14th to 17th centuries, words were adopted from the 17th century onwards have been borrowed freely from every language, and also from other English-speaking communities, notably America. Dialects often elucidate the history of pronunciation.
Of